Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am here with another palettes on the shopping block duping out my collection video. Today I'm going to tackle 3 different palettes. One of them is very small, which is why I'm going to tackle 3 in this video. So since I have 3 palettes, I'm going to jump straight into it because it might be a little bit of a longer one. But before I jump into any of that, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So the first palette that we have that I'm going to compare today is this one right here, which is the Charlotte Tilbury palette. This is the Exaggerate eyeshadow palette, and it's this like beautiful little quad. It's obviously a quad, which is why I decided to include this one in this video, especially because like this would be quite small to have on its own. So that's why I have 3 palettes in this video. So let me go ahead and start comparing this palette. So the first palette that I want to compare it to is this one right here, which is the Going Coconuts palette. I'm going to go ahead and scooch these up so you can see the swatches as well. But here we have my arm. So hopefully you can see there the swatches. I feel like in this palette we have 3 out of 4 shades compared. I was kind of thinking about putting this shade, the cocoa, here for this kind of shimmer shade because they are similar. Let me go ahead and do that, but I don't really consider these dupes. Let me go ahead and swatch those out. So there you can see that too, but I don't really see them as dupes. I would kind of consider this almost dupes. The first shade here, which is the shade Palm Reader, is compared to the lightest shade in the Charlotte Tilbury palette, and this one is a little bit more kind of white gold, whereas this one is more champagne, but very similar. This one here, Cocoa Crush, is very similar to the second shade. Then for the sparkly shade, we don't really have a topper shade like that in the Colourpop palette, but yeah, they are similar undertones, but this one missing the sparkle. And then for the last shade here, it's again very similar. This one is the shade Shell Yeah from the Going Coconuts palette. So very, very similar palettes. And we're just missing that kind of special sparkle shade. And I also feel like the shimmers in the Colourpop palette is feeling a bit dry, but I think that's because of the age of the palette. But yeah, very similar palettes overall. So the next palette I have to compare here is this one, which is the California Coast palette from Sydney Grace. Initially, I thought this would be quite similar, but I swatched them out and they definitely have different undertones. I wanted to go ahead and swatch through the most similar shades anyway, but you can see they are quite different. The ones in the Sydney Grace palette is very much like pink undertones, where these ones is more still like rosy browns, I would say. So not the same at all, but I wanted to go ahead and swatch them out. Also, like, it's a quad, so it's not that difficult to like compare shades, but I can only really find 2 that were similar, and even so they're not even that similar. The next palette that I have to compare is this one here, which is the Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette. There were a couple shades here that were similar. Nothing is really exact, or like there's one shade that's exact, but here we have these swatches. So the first shade here I feel like is very, very similar. It's just that in a corner kind of highlighting shade, so it's easy to find, but that is the first shade in the palette right there. For the second shade here, I decided to opt to use this one, but this one I would say is almost like a mix between like these 2 shades, but I couldn't really decide which one I want to use where. But since it isn't as sparkly, I decided to compare it to this one, and I don't really have anything similar to this one anyway. Then for the sparkle topper shade, I used this one here, which is more gold, but I do have a theory that if I put this like silver shade on top, which is below it, yeah, it creates almost exactly the same kind of shade, like that warmer base with a silver sparkle on top. Really, really similar. And then lastly in the palette we have this shade here, which is that matte right there. So similar vibes again, but not the same. The next palette I want to compare is the Natasha Denona Bimbo palette. Overall, this leans a lot warmer, but it does have different rows. So this top row is very warm. This middle row is rosy, but it still has a little bit more warmth to it. And then this bottom row is more cool toned. But I feel like overall it's more warm toned. However, I did find a couple shades that are similar, so I have swatched them out here. I actually surprisingly found a matte that is very, very similar, and that is the shade Brayon here. It is one of her cream to powder mattes, which is why it kind of shears out quite a lot and creates almost the same kind of matte as in the Charlotte Tilbury palette. Again, we don't really have any topper shades in this palette. And then for the first shimmer here, which is a deeper shimmer, I decided to go with the shade Shine, which is a little bit more golden tone, but a similar kind of vibe. And then for the lighter shade here, again, it's a little bit deeper and a little bit warmer. We have the shade Monroe. So similar shades, but again, not exact. Then for the last comparison that I'm swatching out, we have the Viseart Paris Edit palette. This one is overall more pink tone than this one is, but there's a couple shades that I feel like are similar, so I have swatched them out right here. I do feel like this is not exact at all. I mean, they're all neutral, so they're all going to look somewhat similar. And the first shade here is way more gold than the one in the Charlotte Tilbury palette, and that is this light shade here. This one here is this shade here, which is definitely more copper, whereas this one is a bit more kind of, I don't know, like minky brown-ish. But I feel like maybe that would be a good mix if I mix this one in here, but maybe it's still a bit more warm, I don't know. But that is the next shade. Again, we don't have any topper shades really, at least not in the same kind of tone as this one. And then lastly, we have the matte, which isn't similar. This one is definitely lighter and a bit more camel tone, which this one is much more kind of rosy. And the matte that I compared is this one here. So again, not super similar, probably the least similar out of the ones that I've had so far. But that is the last palette that I'm swatching out. Then I do have two palettes for honorable mentions. We have two Anastasia palettes actually. The first one is the Sultry palette, this one here. So I do feel like there's a couple shades here that would be similar, but looking at them closely, I don't think I would have too many shades that would be swatchable, I would say. So you do have an unicorn shade, but this one is definitely more sparkly and, I don't know, not as like white. We do have like the shade Rose Quartz, which is a bit more rosy like this one, but again, this one I think is more pink and also more sparkly. We don't really have an exact topper shade. I guess we would have had Cyborg, which is also silver leaning in the sparkles, but it doesn't have that actually a base and it's not as sparkly. And then for the matte, I don't feel like we have anything that is similar in matte. So I decided against swatching these two out. And then the second Anastasia palette we have is this one here, which is the Soft Glam palette, which I feel like would be more similar. But we don't have anything as similar to like this light shade. We do have like Fairy and Tempera. Tempera is matte though, so it wouldn't be the same, and then Fairy is way more golden and a little bit deeper as well. I don't really have anything exact for this color. I would say this most similar shade is probably Rose Pink. Again, we don't have any sparkly toppers. And then for the matte, I feel like Dusty Rose might have been similar, but overall, again, I don't think these palettes are too similar. So here are the shades I picked out for my dupe when it comes to singles, and I have swatched them out right here. I think I did a pretty good job, so let's go through each shade in order. For the lighter shade here, I have chosen a Depotter shade from the Juvia's Place Magic Mini Palette, I think? No. I think Masquerade Mini Palette, which is the shade Giza. Very similar shade. Then for this one here, this one that I've chosen is a little bit more metallic, but overall quite similar. And this one is the shade Versailles from Sydney Grace. For the sparkly topper shade right there, I have chosen this shade from Terra Moons, which is the shade Palladium. It is definitely more opaque, but you can shear it out, and when sheared out, it does get that like a sparkle effect. I would say it's more dimensional, it's more shiny, and it's slightly less silver than the one in the Charlotte Tilbury palette, but it does give a similar effect. Then for the matte, the one that I've chosen is slightly bit lighter. That one is from Sydney Grace, and that is the shade Honesty, which is very similar in undertone, but again, a little bit lighter than the one in the Charlotte Tilbury palette, but it's the closest that I have. So, when it comes to this palette, do I need it? Absolutely not. I mean, although I couldn't really find exact dupes for everything, it's just very redundant, and I have shadows like this in my collection, like similar shades, maybe not exact, but very similar shades. Will I declutter it though? I'm not sure yet. It's a really nice compact little palette. It's very like stunning. It's Charlotte Tilbury, which is nice. And the shades in here does create a really nice like everyday look. It would be good for traveling, but I don't really travel much. So, you know, at the moment I'm very torn whether to keep this or not. It is a stunning palette. And I could easily like pass this on because it's been barely touched, but I'm not sure yet. I will have to play around with it a bit more and then make up my mind. But for now, obviously, it's staying, and I will update you guys at the end of the year. The next palette that I want to compare is the Wilderness palette from Beauty Bay. This one is going to be a bit more harder to compare, I think, because it is way more colorful. It's like rainbow, and I don't really have any rainbow palettes in my collection. But I'm hoping that I can, with a couple palettes combined, dupe this palette out. So we'll see how I go. But the first palette that I want to compare it to is this one right here, which is the Kaleidos Collab Nebula palette, which also has a lot of like rainbow kind of shades. It doesn't have like this bright red though, and like it's also missing like some of the yellow tones and oranges and things like that, but it does have a little bit of the same kind of vibes. So I have swatched out all of the similar shades. This is it right here. So let's go through them. First up, the first part of the palette here, we do have dupes for most of them. So the first one here, the blue, is very similar. Actually, there's a light shade here, like a skin tone shade, which we don't have, but that doesn't really matter too much. So we do have this like light blue, which is the shade 7 of 9 compared to Sky, which is very similar. Then we have this shade here, which is the first shade in the Kaleidos palette, Firefly, compared to Ray. The one in the Kaleidos palette is definitely more kind of green leaning, whereas the one in the Beauty Bay palette is more kind of gold, but very, very similar. Same with this blue as well. These two are very similar as well. And then these kind of shimmery shades aren't exactly the same. The one in the Beauty Bay palette is a bit more kind of purpley blue, but this one is a bit more turquoisey blue, but again, very similar. I would say this part of the palette is almost covered. Moving down a little bit, we don't have anything for the more kind of brighter greens, or like the kind of more, I don't know, like bluish undertone greens, but when we move on to like these ones here, we do have a couple. So first up we have this kind of shade here, which is the shade Queen of Blades, and I have compared that to the shade Ivy, which also has that kind of same undertone, although this one is a little bit less blue undertone, whereas this one has a bit more blue, but again quite similar. I have also compared the shade Leaf with the shade Gravity. The shade Gravity is definitely more electric and has more kind of yellow to it, but it does give a similar vibe, and I feel like if these were blended out, they would kind of have a similar effect. I actually realized that Leaf is something that I don't have too many similar shades to, just because of the undertone of it. Moving on, we have the shade here, which is the shade Fossil, and I have compared that to Celestial, but I don't think they're super similar. This one is a duochrome like pink to bronze, whereas this one is more of a bronze. It does have a little bit of pink to it, but not like the same kind of vibrant pink as the shade in here. But you know, I thought it would be fun to compare anyway. Then for these two reds, they are very, very similar. We had Red Giant from the Kaleidos palette, and then the shade Raw from the Beauty Bay palette, very similar. And then for the shade Heat, I decided to compare that to Nebula. Although Nebula isn't that red, it does have like a red shift to it though, which is why I decided to compare them, but they aren't super similar. But that is the Kaleidos palette compared to the Beauty Bay Wilderness. The next palette I want to compare is the Stone Vase palette from Urban Decay. This one might not look super similar, but I found a couple shades that I feel like are similar. So I have swatched them out right here, so let's go through them. We do have a setting shade in both palettes, which is this one here. Then for the blue shimmer, they aren't again exact. The one in the Beauty Bay palette is a bit more purple leaning, whereas this one here, which is the Ojo, is a little bit more kind of cobalt blue. For the greens here, they are relatively similar. We have the shade Jade compared to the shade Moss in the Beauty Bay palette. Again, not exact, but similar vibes. These two are also quite similar. We have the shade Fossil compared to the shade Tiger's Eye. Tiger's Eye is a little bit more dimensional, but quite similar actually, I would say. One that isn't super similar though is this one here, which is the shade Meditate compared to the shade Heat. This one is definitely more bronzy and like pinky, whereas this one is red. And then for the browns, we have them here. This one has a redder undertone. This one has more of a kind of yellowy undertone, I would say. So not super similar, but I thought I would compare them anyway. So a couple shades, especially like the shimmer shades, are covered in this palette, I would say, but not the mattes. Next up, we have the Odin's Eye Judy palette. This is the Red Dragon palette. This one has been discontinued, but it's in my collection, so I wanted to compare them anyway. And there's actually a few more shades than I thought that would be similar, and I have swatched them out here. All of the shades are in this side of the palette, nothing in the blue and green kind of section up here. So let's go through them. First up, we have this shade here, which is the shade Solar Flare compared to Lime. This one is definitely more like a green gold kind of shade, whereas this one is more kind of grass green, but you know, it's similar vibes. I feel like this one is almost like a mix between this shade and this shade. Then we have the shade Jade compared to Leaf, and this one is actually similar to Leaf. I did say earlier that I don't have anything super similar, but this one actually does compare quite nicely. Then here we have the shade Sunrise, which is actually the brown here in the palette. It looks more yellow once swatched out, and I compare that to Marigold. This shade here is the shade Overheat, and I compare that to Fossil. Here we have Dragon compared to Poppy. This one is Fire compared to Raw. We don't have anything for this red shimmer. And then for the browns, we have the shade Claw compared to Earth. And this one has been sheared out a little bit because it is a bit deeper. And then lastly, we have the shade Serene compared to Sunrise. This one is a bit more peachy. This one is a bit more kind of orange, but similar vibes. So I feel like this bottom half of the palette has a lot of overlap. But again, you're missing these kind of bluey greens. The last palette I want to swatch out for this palette is this here, which is the Raw Beauty Christie and Colourpop palette at first sight. And originally I thought these would be quite similar. However, when I swatched these out, there's not that many similar shades, so let's go through them. First up, we have this shade here, which is the shade PNW from the First Sight palette. I would say that this one is almost like a mix between these two. This one here is almost like a mix between these two, and this one is slightly off. Like it's almost like a mix between these two. Yeah, I don't know. I just pair them with the closest shade, I would say, but this one here is compared to there. Then for this here, we have the shade Emerald City compared to Eucalyptus. Then we have the shade here, which is Fiddlehead compared to... No, sorry, this one is that one. This shade here was Ivy, actually. Then we have Marigold compared to Chanterelle. And down here we have Amanita, I think, compared to Raw. And then lastly we have the shade Puffball compared to Earth. So yeah, I would definitely have thought these were more similar than they are, but there's not actually a lot of shades that overlap. Then lastly, before doing the singles, I do also have this palette here, which I think is quite similar, which is the Subculture palette. This palette here, I did actually swatch out in my first edition of this video, where I compare these two, like this one compared to Subculture, because Subculture was in the first video. So I won't swatch them out again. If you want to see the comparison, you can watch that video. So here we have all of the single eyeshadow shades. I feel like I did a pretty good job just looking at them side by side. I will go ahead and show you the swatches in a second, but yeah, just looking at the overview, I think I did a pretty good job. So I'm just going to do my arm like this because it's quite a few swatches and I think it's better to fit them in like this. But I'm going to go ahead and show you each shade in order. So first up here we have a skin tone shade. This is from the NYX In Your Element Air Palette, which is the palette I use it in a lot of these kind of videos because it's the best setting shade that I have. Here we have the shade Azure Skies from Terra Moons. This one is the shade Lucidium from Cleona. Here we have hashtag It's a Boy from Sydney Grace. And then lastly, for the first row right here, we have the shade Crown Glass from Cleona. That is the first comparison. Moving on, here we have the shade Evergreen from Sydney Grace. We have the shade Heirloom from Cleona. Here we have Fourth Dimension from Terra Moons. And then this one here is Shamrock from Sydney Grace. And lastly, we have a Key Lime from Sydney Grace. So that is the second row right there. Moving on to the third row. First up, we have this one here, which is Patina Light from Cleona. We have this one here, which is Quasnick, I think that's how you say it, from Glam Shop. It's the shade Acidic, I think, in English, but I have the old Polish version. It's labeled in yellow tone, but it's the closest that I have in my singles. Then we have this one here, which is from Colourpop. It's from my Just My Luck palette in the shade Mobamba, and that is this one here. Then here we have the shade Haystack from Sydney Grace, and then lastly for the third row we have the shade Peach Rose, was it? Yeah, Peach Rose from the Pastel Roses, and that is the that's the third row right there. Then for the last kind of shadows right here, we have this shade here, which is the product from the Beauty Bay NYX Tutorials palette, and it's the shade Mikai. Then here we have a Colourpop shadow again, and this is the shade Blank Canvas right there. This here is a Terra Moons eyeshadow. It's more of a multi-chrome, but I feel like it does have a red shade on, and it goes into like loads of different ones, and that is the shade Martian Dust right there. Second to last here we have the shade Frank from Colourpop, and lastly we have the shade Rule from MAC, and that is the last row right there. So again, overview right here. I think I did a pretty decent job with the dupes for this palette. So there we have my Wilderness palette. This one is one that I feel like I don't have anything specifically exactly like, but obviously I could dupe it out with my singles, and I also feel like I have other palettes that cover parts of this palette. But yeah, that is this palette. Let's move on to the last one. So the next palette that we have is this one right here, which is the Book of Magic palette, again from Beauty Bay. I'm going to go ahead and compare this one. And first up, I do want to pull out a palette that we already talked about, which is the Club Nebula palette from Kaleidos. I feel like there's a lot of overlapping shades here as well, so I have swatched them out. And actually there's less than I thought, but there are 5 that I want to compare. Sorry, yeah, 5. So first up we have this one here, which is the shade Cylon, compared to this one here, Voodoo. Then we have this one here, which is Astro, compared to the shade Spell. The blues here are similar. This one is a little bit more kind of this kind of undertone, but you know, similar enough. And that is the shade 709. Then we have this shade here, which is the shade Nova. This one is more of a true silver, whereas this one is a blue iridescent, but I feel like they give similar vibes and I actually would prefer this shade here. Then lastly, we have the shade Void compared to the shade Cursed. So those are the shades that I feel like are similar in this palette. Second up is another repeat palette. This one here is the Stone Vibes palette from Urban Decay again. And again, I have a couple of shades that I feel like are overlapping. First up, we have a setting shade in both palettes. The one in the Book of Magic palette is a little bit deeper and a little bit more yellow toned. Then we have these two here, which is the shade Tiger's Eye compared to Stardust. Moving on to the second row of the Book of Magic pack, we have center shade Crystal, which I have compared to Bloodstone. I feel like they are quite similar. Then we have quite a big jump until this shade here, which is the shade Charmed. I compared it to Raw Energy, but Raw Energy is definitely more cool tone, so not the best comparison, but I decided to keep it in. Then we have the shade Moonlight compared to the shade Opal Aura. Quite similar again, both are like silvery kind of shades. And then lastly, we have the shade Ojo compared to Potion. So those are the comparisons I feel like are similar from the Stone Vibes palette. The next palette that I want to compare is the Luna Beauty, what's it called? The Luna Beauty Eternal Eclipse palette, which has a lot of blue tones as well, mixed with neutrals. This is the shades that I decided are similar. We have a couple again neutrals and a couple blues. So first up, this kind of bronzy shade here is the shade Desert Sky. It's a little bit deeper than Stardust, but kind of similar undertones. Next up, we have the shade Sandstone, and this one is compared to Amulet. The shade Sandstone is a little bit deeper, but I feel like if we mixed it in with Dusk, it would give a very similar vibe. Then we have the shade Flare compared to the shade Alchemy, and these two are almost exact. After that is quite a big jump in the palette, and the next one we have is the black one, which is the shade Hex compared to Night Sky. Night Sky does have glitters in it, but you know, I feel like you can easily blend those away, and both of them are blacks. Then we have the silver shade here, which is the shade Adamantium, I think, compared to Moonlight. So that is the next shade. Then we have a deep blue Lagoon compared to Cursed. We have like a blackish kind of sparkly shade. It's quite similar, but it's missing a little bit of the blue undertone. And that's the shade Starry Eyed compared to Jinx. And then lastly, we have the shade Deep Sea compared to Potion. And those are the shades in here that I feel like are similar. So the last palette that I want to compare before going to the singles is the Blueberry Muffin palette from BH Cosmetic, because it also has a lot of blue tones. And there's a couple shades that are similar, but not too many again. I feel like this is quite a hard palette to dupe out. First up, we have this shade here, which is the shade Sweet from the Blueberry Muffin palette compared to the shade Alchemy. Quite similar undertones, quite similar shades. Then for the black, we have the shade Hex compared to Baker's Dozen. Again, Baker's Dozen has shimmer running through it, but I think they would work in a similar way. Next up, we have the shade Moonlight compared to Hot and Fresh. Both are silvers. These two shades are quite similar. We have Jinx compared to Stud Muffin. Then we have the shade Trick compared to So Good. And lastly, we have the shade Potion compared to Tempting. I feel like the undertones are different there, but you know, similar kind of shades. So those are the last ones before we go into the singles. So here we have my single shadows. And swatching out the single shadows actually made me realize a mistake, which is quite annoying, but it is what it is. I don't know how many of you have picked it up by now, but in my arm swatches, which I'm going to give you a peek of now, I've actually forgotten a shade. I forgot to include the shade Manifest, which is this deep brown. I noticed that when I was going to swatch out this one. I'm not going to redo all of the swatches. What I'll do is I'll pull out all the palettes separately and see what I have similar to that from each palette before finishing up the video. But yeah, quite annoying. But let me go through the swatches that I have so far one by one. So again, this is my dupe palette and this is the arm swatches. So first up right here, we have a Sydney Grey shade. This is the shade Lemon Cream. It does have that like yellow undertone, same as this one here. Next up, we have the shade Heiress from Cleona right there. It's a little bit more kind of, it has like a pink shift, but otherwise it's quite similar. Here we have the shade Toffee from Sydney Grays. Next up, we have this shade here, which is the shade Aura Regalium from Terra Moons compared to the shade Alchemy. Then we have the shade here, which is from Terra Moons again, and it's the shade Utopia compared to the shade Enchanted. So that is the first row. So moving on to the second row, that is where we're missing that shade originally, but we're going to move into this one next, which isn't the best kind of dupe. We have the shade Sea Breeze from Sydney Grace. Here we have the shade Carbon from Cleona. This one is Colourpop Iffy. And this one here is Colourpop Filtered. So that is the second row. For the third row of the palette, we are starting off right here. We have the shade Scuba Diver from Sydney Grace. Here we have the shade Barbados from Pastel Roses. And this is the shade Let's Do It from Colourpop. Then we have this one, which is Gumdrop from Sydney Grace. And lastly, we have Oasis from Sydney Grace. And that is the third row of the palette. Then for the final shades down here, first up we have this shade here, which is Schlager from Glam Shop. It's a little bit more, it's not as silver, but I prefer that shade actually, and I don't really have anything as pure white as this one in my collection. It's my singles collection at least. Then we have hashtag It's a Boy, same as what I use for the Wilderness palette. This here is the shade Lunette from Cleona. Then we have the shade Detour from Colourpop. And lastly, we have the shade Crown Jewel from Cleona. It's a little bit brighter than this one, but I preferred that shade anyway. So those are the swatches. Let me see if I can fit them all in frame. And that, yeah, is the comparisons for my dupe palettes. So before we wrap up the video, I do want to compare Manifest. So the one that I decided to go with for my dupe was this one here, which isn't really that similar. It's just the shade Love and Happiness from Sydney Grace. I don't really have anything with that undertone. That is the shade right there. That's the shade Manifest. And this is my comparison shade right there, which is definitely more gray tone. This one has almost like a mustardy, like pukey kind of undertone, which is really interesting, but I don't have anything super similar to that. And I also went through the other palettes to see if I had anything similar, and I don't. So first up we have the shade from the Blueberry Muffin palette. We have the shade 350 Degrees, which again isn't very similar at all. Next to that we have the shade here, which comes from the Eternal Eclipse palette, and it's the shade Earthbender, which was this one here. Again, not very similar at all. It's definitely more warm toned. And lastly, we have this one here from Zone Vibes, and it's the shade Hexed, which is this one is definitely lighter and again way more warm toned. And also from the Club Nebula palette, we don't really have anything similar, so I didn't swatch anything for there. But yeah, quite interesting that this kind of boring brown that I said, oh, it doesn't matter, I forgot it because it's a boring brown, I actually don't have anything similar to in either of the palettes. So that is it for this palette. I actually realized that I have like quite a few like unique shades in this palette, especially like this one for example, and like some of these more kind of purpley pinks and the blues have unique undertones. However, I'm still not sure if I want to keep this palette because a lot of here that I don't really like. I don't really like this shade, it's too like deep. I have a black. This shade here doesn't perform very well. To be fair, the shimmers in general doesn't really perform very well. Some of them are okay, but not, you know, it's nothing special. So it's just a lot of this palette that I don't really use on an everyday basis. So if I were to declutter this palette, I feel like what I would do is I would depot the shades that are unique for me and put them into my singles collection. But we'll see how I go and what I decide to do at the end of the year. But that is this palette right here. So that, you guys, was it for this video. I hope it wasn't too long. I feel like I've been filming for ages. I think I've probably been doing this for like 2 hours, including picking up the single shadows for each palette. I do only have one part left in this video, which will come up I think in a couple of weeks maybe. I don't know how my film schedule looks, but I think maybe in 2-3 weeks. So you can look forward to that, but in the meantime make sure to check out my next video going up, and I will catch you then. Bye guys!